Chapter 19 Antagonism of My Own Class. There's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. My social service, which fixed its center in the birth control movement, with a sort of league for women's economic independence tied in, though supported enthusiastically for a while, came at last upon a stumbling block. The obstacle was encountered suddenly and in quite an unexpected direction. In July 1923, the press in Japan reported a sad piece of news in an ultra-sensational fashion with grotesque headlines. Its substance was the story of a double suicide committed by Mr. Takeo Arishima, a prominent author and idealist, and Miss Aki Hatano, wife of a businessman and a member of the editorial staff of the Women's Review, the most progressive and popular women's magazine in Japan. They both belonged to our birth control research group, the Rashio Kai. Mr. Arishima had been regarded as a leading spirit in the Young Japan movement. Miss Hatano was one of the outstanding feminists and intellectuals. Liberalism thus received what the West would call a black eye. The affair affected me intimately. Miss Hatano had been one of my close friends, as well as a member of the Rashio Kai. When we discussed the social position of Japanese women and the problems of life in general, she was rather inclined to a fatalistic attitude, while I was full of challenging verve. Nevertheless, Miss Hatano was a hard worker and maintained a high standard in her writing and editing. Her strict sense of responsibility to her magazine brought results in the fascination it had for a large circle of readers. Miss Hatano personally was a rare beauty. That fact heightened the sensation over the suicide reported in the papers. She had been one of the most sophisticated and lovely young women of present-day Japan. She was a modern Osen of the Harunobo prince, with her delicate figure, fine oval face, and long glossy hair. Her modern interest had not destroyed her attractiveness in the slightest degree. They had only enhanced it. She and her husband had lived in a neat home on the outskirts of Tokyo, facing Mount Fuji, in a purely Japanese way representing the old Edo style, the most urbane of the Tokugawa era. Miss Hatano had studied Western as well as Japanese literature. She had an intellectual grasp of modern liberal thought, but emotionally she was still a woman of the Tokugawa age. Her husband was good to her, but he lacked sympathy with her liberalism. His love for his wife was the love for a little bird in a cage. He wanted to pet her within the safe shelter of his home. Miss Hatano was thus an Ibsen Nora in Japan. When she awakened intellectually, she could no longer stay in her pretty cage. She sought intellectual and personal freedom. Like many men in the history of social evolution, Mr. Hatano tried to clip his wife's wings and keep her by his side alone. Miss Hatano told some of us about her domestic struggle, and her story stirred our hearts. The Nora of Japan struggled for more after she had had a bite of the sweet apple. The great author's great passion for her. The outcome was her decision that she and her lover had best die in a moment of ecstasy, for thus they could attain immortality of spirit. So they faced death happily. By prearrangement, they went to Karuizawa, where they brought life to a close by hanging themselves in Arishima's villa. Their corpses were discovered a month later. Among many letters they left at the place, one from Miss Hatano addressed to me explained the motive of her suicide. I was able to meet in some measure the fierce criticism of that portion of the public who tried to lay the blame for this tragedy upon me. Mr. Takeo Arishima was a Tolstoy in Japan. He had been in the United States and was a great admirer of Whitman, whom he had translated into Japanese. His many novels and essays on social themes were popular and influential with the progressive younger generation. He inherited a large fortune in the form of estates in Hokkaido, but the Tolstoyan influence had induced him to hand over his farms to the peasants who actually tilled the soil. He gave them complete possession. There were no reservations, even as to management. His sincere humanism made him denounce the system of private ownership and the inheritance of large fortunes as parasitic with respect to the owners and exploitive with respect to laborers. Though he escaped from the inconsistent position of a great landlord, he could not throw himself into the radical communist movement. Non-resistance was his creed. After his wife's death, he led a kind of hermit life for some time with his 3 sons. Therefore, his romantic suicide was a tremendous shock to the nation. Since this love affair between the great author and the great feminist extended beyond the limit of the social code, they anticipated that social criticism would be too severe to bear. Conservative people said, "Behold, as our great Confucius preached, there is no way to teach women and fools. Men must be careful about women, for there is always a woman at the back of a sin." Several disciples of Arishima joined in this attack, declaring Miss Hatano to be a hateful vamp who had lured their beloved master to destruction. It was all because of this sinful creature that their revered humanist was dead and his 3 sons orphaned. There was much natural expression of grief among his followers for their lost leader, but the strange thing to me was that both conservatives and progressives utterly blamed the woman and acquitted the man. The Arishima funeral was well attended and impressive. Miss Hatano was buried without a single attendant, other than her faithful maid, who carried her ashes in a plain wooden box to the grave. It was the punishment for her sin, the public said. The attitude of the public perplexed me. I could see no reason why the woman was charged with guilt and the man absolved from guilt. They had committed suicide under the same sense of responsibility and mutual agreement. If Miss Hatano was to be criticized, why not Mr. Arishima too? Why was man exempt from blame and woman alone made to bear the cross? What were the liberal ideas worth in practice that these so-called progressive men bandied about? Was liberalism to be applied to men only? With the condemnation of Miss Hatano went bitter censure for the entire female sex heaped upon it through attacks on her female friends. In a land still under the spell of the feudal family system, Confucianism and Buddhism, all of which conspire to belittle women, there was little chance for the criticized women to defend themselves. The point of the argument used against me in the press was that I should have checked this extreme conduct of the lovers while there was yet time to prevent the climax. The fact that I did not do so proved that I was an accomplice in the guilt of drawing the great author to destruction, that I was a loathsome rebel against the social order. Frivolous journalism selected me for its special target, since the dead woman, being speechless, was no longer interesting. I never had heard such unreasonable arguments with respect to any theme. It was true that Miss Hatano had often come to see me. She told me about her struggles, but I always advised her to cut clean through her difficult situation. I never did encourage her to die. I thought she was merely romancing when she declared that she admired enormously the great actress, Sumako Matsui, who had hanged herself with a scarlet silk sash, symbol of passionate love, to join her deceased lover in spirit. Days and months passed after her own suicide. Innumerable articles appeared in the papers and magazines criticizing women cynically or sensationally. Personally, I could not whip the dead people, nor did I try to offer an explanation of their act or to refute the unkind words which went so wide off the mark. I held aloof from the discussion, leaving time to answer all the untrue charges. However, I did not escape personal injury through the suicide of my friend. On my return from travels in the Western countries, I had broken the shackles of mean conventions little by little, had taken steps along the road to emancipation for myself, and pointed the way for others. I began to conduct myself as a person and not as exploited family property. I disregarded the social prejudices against independent action for a woman. I regarded the birth control movement as the pole star guiding women from slavery and unceasing poverty to personality and culture. The more I experimented with liberty, however, the more I stimulated the jealousy of the women of my class, who, though their eager fingers were moving towards the trident, lacked courage to reach for it, to break the fetters which tied them down to the bondage of the rigid family system. Always on this hard march of mankind and womankind towards the future, the path of one who attempts to open the road wider for others must apparently be beset with prejudices and opposition from the very people in whose behalf obstructive brambles and weeds are being cut away. So the incident of the illustrious love suicide gave the society ladies of all Japan a good chance to shoot arrows at me. The more superficial of them began at once to turn their backs towards me, and their hostility hindered my social activities. It finally forced me to retreat to the family circle myself. I was suddenly compelled to realize again the power of the feudal element in Japan, still holding down the burgess class. I also recognized how utterly unfair even burgess journalism was towards women, and how fickle and cowardly was the world in general, which always went over to the side of the strong. I awakened to the fact that it is harder to get a person to defend the weak than to find a star on a black night. I stood alone in the midst of social protest and fury. To my great annoyance, amounting at times to despair of making headway. Even the birth control movement, in which I had been so active, was called a plaything of a Burgess woman, as if I were advocating the control of children for my own fitful pleasure. I felt completely deserted socially. It was hard to put faith in anybody anywhere. I had to stop a minute and look over the world around me, again from a colder and wiser perspective, having fancied myself a strong character after being tossed about by the rough dealings of my fellows. I discovered myself to be just a poor sailor, who could only row a boat in a bay of calm water. I tried to quiet myself by thinking philosophically, and watching for blue sky above the angry waves, but the stormy sea seemed to put my happy starting at naught. I had been frank, trustful, and open-hearted. Now I became skeptical and suspicious of everything. However, the storms could not beat me down forever. My little bark was launched upon its humanistic course again. The fire in my heart blazed up with still more courage and a stronger willpower. I resolved that if the lack of understanding of the birth control principle caused the unreasonable attacks upon me, I would show up their weaknesses and battle more courageously for the movement, fully aware that the poisonous arrows were shot from the fortress where feudalism had its lair, and that the tactic was designed to isolate the crusader of feminism from her followers. In time I was spurred again to action on women's behalf. But I re-entered the fray outwardly calm, and before long the journalistic attacks, which had been floating around like rootless seaweed, disappeared from the surface of the press. Forces invisible to the public tried to draw me back behind the walls of a feudal family tradition, in a continuous pulling. Still I stood with my back against these walls, as courageously as I could, carrying on my birth control movement, my business adventure, and my knitting class culminating in jobs for other women, amid the sneers and jeers of my countrymen. It had been my firm belief that I could satisfactorily attend to my duties within the family as wife and mother, and at the same time take an energetic part in public work. However, I got no cooperation from the family system. It was as if I had come to a crossroad where I must decide whether I should take the path leading to individualism and be faithful primarily to myself, or retrace my steps in womanly submission like the multitudes of my sex, for the sake of peace. But how could I in reality look upon my undertakings in the line of public work, as lightly as I might put the match to a firecracker? I struggled to be faithful to my personal conviction, and redoubled my social activities, while I attempted to establish a warmer relationship with my family. It seemed that life must run more smoothly, but it did not so run. The pressure from my own dear people towards conformity, on my part, weighed more and more heavily upon me. My immediate family and my relatives looked upon me as a black sheep. I could not hope for sympathy from friends whose eternal moral code was feminine sacrifice. Men regarded me as a dreadful shrew. My very husband, who had formed my personality by his insistence on my becoming an independent woman, and who had encouraged me to shake off feudalistic bondage, took a neutral attitude towards my actual struggles. I could not quite comprehend what made him reverse his attitude. My love for him had never changed, but I could get no word of consolation from him. The only comfort which came to my wounded heart was my children's affection and health. I seemed to hear them always whispering in my ears. Mother should be strong. Mother should not lead a slave existence. Chapter 20. The Earthquake. Mankind is gifted with a happy nature, which enables it to minimize past evils, even of the most tragic kind. The records of Japanese history warn us that Tokyo is to be visited by a great earthquake every 100 years, and in my home there was a large tablet dedicated to the spirit of my husband's grandfather, on which was written in beautiful calligraphy the fact that he died in the earthquake of Yedo in the second year of Ansei, 1855. His son, the late Baron Shinroku Ishimoto, was saved at the time by being squeezed out from between the pillars of the house, which collapsed at the first shock. Nevertheless, neither memories of family events nor warnings of the impending destruction disturbed the complacency of the Japanese in the summer of 1923. People were just as happy and gay as ever. The city of Tokyo was a scene of hurrying and bustling as usual. With bright plans for tomorrow, the citizens looked into the future cheerfully. Our modern science had not yet advanced far enough to forecast the course of subterranean phenomena and broadcast it by radio. So the great earthquake of my time came unexpectedly at 2 minutes before 12 in the forenoon of September 1st, 1923. When the first tremor was felt, we repeated the popular myth, jestingly, about the huge catfish, which lives underground, wriggling mightily. We were not afraid. At that time, we were living at Kamakura, where we had built, for the children's health, a house in the compound noted for its big bronze statue of Daibutsu Buddha. The day of the earthquake, I had come to my office in Tokyo, in the morning as usual. I was sitting at my desk on the 3rd floor of the Mutual Insurance Building in Kiyobashi, looking at my business letters, when the tremor started. The building was 8 stories high, a modern concrete structure. With horrible rumbling noises, the earthquake shook this building up, and down, and to and fro. The bookshelves and the glass cabinets in which the sample yarns were shown all turned over. I got up from my seat, but could not walk even a step. I felt a strange giddiness. Was the earth revolving? No, it was tumbling, tossing, and whirling. When the first shock stopped, all who were in the room took deep breaths and looked at one another smilingly. Nobody screamed. No one could so much as utter a sound. Suddenly, again and again, the earth upheaved. The sun was covered with yellowish, smoky clouds. I managed to stumble across the corridor into my husband's office. "Help me to send a wire to the children," were the words that I instinctively spoke to him. We did not realize that there would follow several hundred more shakes, succeeded by terrible conflagrations, which were to sweep over 2/3 of Tokyo, taking 90,000 lives and causing 70,000 persons to be injured or missing. I touched the telephone, but found it was useless. The post and telegraph office had already been crushed. The trembling and shaking of the ground under our feet continued, and I saw from the office window that many warehouses with their plaster walls were now only a heap of debris. Gray clay tiles which had covered practically all the Japanese houses at the time, had fallen to the ground, and the clouds of dust created by crumbling walls and breaking tiles, mingled with the disturbed dry earth, presented a ghastly sight wherever one looked. In the meantime, fires had started here and there, and I had no courage to remain in the office building any longer. I dismissed all the employees, closed the door, and went out into the street, then full of people, grown frantic. They could not scurry home, for all the tram cars stood deserted on the track. The electric system had broken down. Fortunately, we had our own car, into which my husband and I jumped and drove as best we could to my parents' home. My father's castle-like house, constructed on a concrete foundation, stood apparently intact. But when I opened the front door, I saw the porcelain and pottery vases, bronze statues of elephants, lacquer boxes and pictures, truly every bit of ornament hung on the walls, or placed on the mantelpiece, on the floor, smashed into bits. The big chandeliers swung wide and almost touched the ceiling every time a tremor came. There was not a sign of a human being in the house, and a strange fear seized me of some terrible calamity befalling the family. In fact, however, my family were all miraculously saved. The big concrete chimney of their house, at the first shake, had plunged in heavy chunks through the roof to the basement, crashing through the dining room floor on its way. My parents and younger sister had just been summoned to lunch and were about to go down the stairs. Immediately, the main earthquake came, and as my father and sister instinctively stepped out to the balcony in their alarm, the crashing chimney carried them away in its deadly embrace. My mother was spared only because she remembered the youngest son on the third floor, in time to retreat from her rush to the balcony. Luckily, my father and sister were more frightened than hurt when they were shot to the basement with the monstrous masses of the chimney, augmented by a large section of the dining room floor. They were not caught under the weight. They were just a part of the debris, bruised as to shoulders, arms, and hips, and horribly messy. When I reached home, they lay on mats in the back garden in their blood-stained white summer kimonos. Nobody dared to enter what remained of the house because of the continued quakes. If in memory a certain comedy is suggested by this picture, jesting is sobered by the thought of many Japanese who were killed in their Western-style houses in just that way. To discover that my parents were safe, if bruised and shocked, was a great relief to me. But there were my children farther away. What of them at Kamakura? My husband, knowing the hazards of a drive in the car over the quivering streets amid the falling buildings, advised me to stay with my parents and help them while he made a dash for Kamakura. And as soon as he left, I thought it best to follow his advice and see about food. Accompanied by my brothers and servants, armed with large furoshiki, I bought rice, flour, canned goods of every kind, bean paste, sugar, salt, fruits, bread, and such other commodities as we could obtain by entreaty when payment ceased to be sufficient for a sale. Seeing a good-sized ham suspended from the ceiling of the butcher's shop, I asked for that. holding out the proper price, but the butcher refused to sell the ham to me. I begged him again and again for it, reminding him that my father's house had been his customer for more than 20 years. At least, I urged, he could cut me off a portion. After some minutes of insistence on my part, the butcher, looking at my face and at the large ham alternately, said, "Madame, for a special reason, I cannot sell even a piece." He smiled at me. Then I guessed his secret and had to go away laughing. It was only a handsome painted object, stuffed with cotton, and hung in the shop for show, a deceit not to be noticed in ordinary times. While I was scouting around for food for my parents and their household, my husband was trying to reach our children. He could drive his car as far as the outskirts of the city. From there, as the roads were covered with crushed houses, he had to clamber over the ruins on foot. The earth was cracked everywhere, and there was practically no trace of a road. What is more, to avoid the conflagration in the low-lying Yokohama district, he had to climb up and down hills. The distance between Tokyo and Kamakura was about 40 miles on the old open road, but he reached our own home only after going in the most indirect fashion and after 12 hours of walking and walking through the night. In the morning he found Kamakura in ruins, a heap of ashes and rubbish. The earthquake in Kamakura district had been followed by a tidal wave, which completely cleared the shore of boats and houses, together with thousands of precious human lives. Our dwelling was one of the very few which did not completely collapse, and it escaped fire too, so the children were also safe. They did not even utter a cry in the terrible disaster, we were told, for they were too small to realize the general horror of this calamity. My maids all stayed faithfully at their post. They did not run to their own home, but guarded our children, spending the night, so fearful for them, in the garden beside the big image of Buddha until the master arrived. My husband tried to relieve my anxiety by letting me know that the children were all right, but there was no way to transmit the cheering news. Our private family fared better than the royal family. One prince and two princesses of the blood passed away, their promising young lives cut off in the first crash of the disaster. The sad news was announced a few days later on a page of newspaper printed by a hand machine, the first printed item of public information to circulate after the destruction of all communication and traffic. 3 days were spent in an atmosphere like Dante's Inferno, to experience an actual hell on earth before one is sentenced by the king of hell, according to Buddhist myth, is a treat reserved for the Japanese, who live on top of a volcano. Westerners have spoken of our smiling faces in hours of tragedy, but we are not strangers to fear, continually terrified by rumors of what was happening and developing in the downtown district. My father's household, including myself, huddled together the first night in the dark garden. We were told that the whole district downtown was aflame, and that men, women, children, houses, bicycles, horses, and motor cars were all caught in the blaze, there being no means of escape from the Holocaust. We climbed a nearby hill and saw with our own eyes a fire start from a chemical school about a mile distant from our house, but there was no wind to bend it in our direction. There was terrible heat. Immediately, the water service was cut off entirely, and the electric and gas services were ruined too. So we realized that we might be caught in a fire ourselves, at any moment coming from any direction. In that case, we should have for our protection neither water nor police. Firemen were helpless throughout the city. Fire was king, as the Americans would say. Red flames began to burst everywhere we looked, from beneath the debris of crushed wooden pillars and beams. Rapidly they increased in number and vigor. Between earth tremors we found courage to rescue essentials for living, and family treasures, which we hid as well as we could in a hole we dug in the ground. It was fortunate that we had a well in our garden, and fresh water to quench our thirst. On the second day, the huge fires, which had been extending westward, turned towards the east and towards us. One of them reached the school building at the other side of our hill. As I watched the building burn, the heat scorched my cheeks. The fire drew nearer, and we decided to carry more of the family treasures to safer spots, as our go-down had been shattered. Unable to do anything for my children, I wondered whether I could do anything about the fine old paintings, which belonged to my husband, handed down to him by his father. These had been placed in storage in a bank in Kyobashi, when we had given up our big house in Koishikawa. It may be that the thought of material losses at a time when hundreds of thousands of human lives are being injured or destroyed is unworthy of man or woman. Certainly, I was grateful for the safety of my relatives, yet I worried over the possible loss of works of art which could never be replaced. And on the second day of the earthquake, I learned that the bank was completely gone. My grief rested on something more than personal deprivation, such art. The effect of this grief was to make me resolve to save at least the collection of old paintings, picture scrolls, and screens, which my husband had collected himself and stored in my father's go-down. The picture scrolls were rolled up in their narrow, long wooden boxes, and some of the boxes were quite heavy, but I carefully and tenderly carried hundreds of them, one by one, to a place which I thought would be secure from fire. The horrible second evening passed, and the third morning came. The fire had almost lapped our garden wall when it veered in the opposite direction, to our unexpected relief. Only then, worn out with the hard labor of moving furniture and other objects round about, did we all take some rest. But first we had to appease our hunger a little somewhat. The end of our woe was not yet on the calendar. On the evening of the third day, the fire consumed all the small houses which surrounded ours. Foreseeing our doom, we carried chairs and other prime comforts to the street, running near the outer moat of the imperial palace, to the fire barrier. Sadly, we bade farewell to the dwelling enjoyed for so many years. As we sat down on our chairs by the moat, my mother and I looked back to see, as we thought, our house turn into flames. My mother uttered no word. She gave forth no cry. She was the daughter of a samurai, but I was less repressed. Ah, everything is gone. Our house, our treasures, all our material possessions, I exclaimed. In that instant, I knew the futility of large material possessions. A whole city, amazingly beautiful, built by hundreds of years of toil, representing incalculable wealth, was destroyed by a single act of nature. Having nothing to do, our group sat on the street, packed with people who, like us, had come away from fallen houses, or from the fire which had consumed them. A few pieces of the small Japanese furniture and apparel wrapped in handkerchiefs and carried on their backs were now their total property. But our eyes were busy, if our hands were idle, as we watched the swarm of men, women, big children, and crying babies, passing to and fro, or squatting beside exhausted, some even sobbing on account of weariness and defeat, one occasionally screaming out in pain. There were those who had left behind, in the crushed houses, their dear relatives, having been unable to rescue them from the weight of the fallen roof, or from the fast-pursuing fire. Some had already walked, and walked for 3 days, without a cup of water to drink, or a grain of rice to eat. They had still to walk on and on. To what destination they did not know. I gave away the biscuits and the water I had brought with me. Quickly I learned a new lesson, the antisocial effects of the rivalry for material possessions, and the brotherly love inherent in economic equality. Here we were, we Japanese, from every class and every grade of income, once competitors and enemies, now on a common level of no possessions. We were friends and cooperators in a trice. My entire family spent that night on the sidewalk of the dusty street, sinking to the ground for a little sleep among the piled-up furniture, amid the noise of destruction and the cries of the refugees who streamed by me endlessly. Exhausted in mind and body, I took my meed of sleep. My father must have been born under a very lucky star, swept by a crashing chimney into its heap of ruins. He got up only somewhat bruised. His house, which the flames had apparently chosen for their prey on the 3rd day of the conflagration, loomed up sound and imposing as ever on the 4th day. It is true that the small tea house in the corner of the garden had perished as had all the green trees, but fire could not penetrate the walls, coated with cement, or the windows of thick glass, which we had closed tightly before we left. The records of the earthquake mark my father's home as the spot where the fire stopped of its own accord. We could not see that clearly as we sat beside the moat. Eventually we came back home carrying our furniture and treasures, dragging our exhausted bodies, our souls sick from witnessing so much suffering. As the terror of immediate fire lightened, my anxiety about my children led me to dispatch messengers to Kamakura. One tried to make the trip by bicycle, but each time the man could only go halfway and had to turn back on account of the cracks in the earth and the debris. Once cities and villages on his way. On the 7th day, I heard that transport by boat to the Yokosuka Naval Harbor had been opened, and so the next day I got a man to take me to this boat. I hoped to reach Kamakura in this manner, since police protection had vanished, and in the abnormal physical and mental conditions, murders were becoming common. It was by no means safe for every woman to move about at will. Hence I dressed myself as a peasant, hoping to be ignored. I covered my head and face with a white and blue cotton cloth. Tenagui put on a plain cotton kimono, tied up my sleeves, and turned up my kimono skirt, making a dirty petticoat and bare feet the high points of the disguise. Thus apparelled, I walked across the ruins of the city to Shibaura harbor, where the boat was anchored. There were no trains, no stations, not even a recognizable harbor. Government buildings had been wiped out, schoolhouses crushed and burned, penal and charitable institutions laid in ruins. As I looked over the confusion of twisted telegraph poles, wires, skeletons of high buildings, burnt corpses and swollen ones floating on the water, frenzied parents seeking their lost children, and deserted children crying for their parents, I thought about the last days of Pompeii, of which I had often heard from Uncle Yasuki in my childhood, while fancying then that the like could happen only in stories. At the Shibaura harbor, I pressed into the crowd of refugees and sailed for Yokosuka. The blue summer sky high above us seemed as serene as if nothing of horror had happened on earth. While I sat with the crowd on the deck of the cargo boat, without shade from the burning sun, I listened to what the others were saying. One tragic tale after another ran around the crowd. I landed at the equally wrecked Yokosuka Naval Harbor, and from there walked back 10 miles to Kamakura. As I passed through the ruins of this town, I saw everywhere on the fallen and deserted houses, pieces of wood, and bunches of burning incense sticks, marking the spots where corpses were lying beneath the debris. As I hurried across the garden by the Daibutsu temple, I caught a glimpse of my 2 children playing, unconscious of tragedy, on the lawn. Chairs, tables, and dishes were in evidence, for the house, though not in ruins, was turned halfway round, and these had been carried outside. My sons ran up to me, and I embraced them without a word, but tears of gratitude to God, who had protected them from the deadly calamity, flowed uncontrolled. Arata told me that he had been fed with macaroni every day since the quake, and that he wanted to eat something else. Taimio, the little one, utterly unaware of the menace to himself in the earthquake, told me how amused he was when he saw the opposite house and the tall pagoda in the temple garden tumble down. The food distribution had been unorganized in this district, and the first thing I had to do was to get some potatoes and fruit from the vicinity for the children who had eaten nothing but canned stuff for a week. Extra bed covers and blankets which I had in my house I gave to neighbors who had lost their all in the fire. As soon as the railway was put in order, we closed this half-burned house and came back to Tokyo by a freight train in the manner of horses and cows. It was better than walking. Since everything was so chaotic as to plans, I decided to take my children, temporarily at least, to my parents' house in Tokyo. We had to think about our own reconstruction, while the government pondered on city reconstruction, how to start again from the bottom and in the ashes. I had lost not only family treasures, but the commodities at my shop. However, when one has to make a clean start, one ceases to think in terms of better and worse. As soon as the temporary repair of the damaged office building was finished, I opened my yarn shop again. It cannot be denied that there were thousands of irreparable tragedies caused by the earthquake of 1923. Among the 3.5 million victims, countless human beings failed to recover from the wreck of matter and the crashing of their world. Yet in the upheaval, the Japanese woman made one astonishing discovery. She found herself, without waiting now for men to take the lead in social organization. Women proceeded in remarkable numbers to take care of those in need. They began with the distribution of milk. When this form of municipal relief was taken up by the city fathers, women turned to distributing food and clothing, and while they were permitted full play for their talents in relief work, a really comprehensive women's movement came into being for the first time. The women of Tokyo learned to cooperate instinctively on a large scale, it appeared. Within a few days after the calamity, they had formed a federation of women's societies to meet the larger demands that would be made upon them after the immediate emergency had been met. The earthquake occurred on the 1st of September. This organization grew so rapidly that by the end of November, at least 42 groups of women had affiliated with it. Social, educational, industrial, political, and labor sections, formed within the Federation, were setting about the most varied kinds of work. Part 8. Seeing the West Again. Chapter 21. America at the zenith of her capitalistic glory. Despite the backwardness of his country, my husband's baptism in the liberal thought of the West, coupled with his foreign experiences, held him loyally for a while to humanistic ideals. His free position after he left the Mitsui Company, his wealth, and his generosity to others, however, tended to divert him gradually from humanistic action. Petty men with selfish designs used his friendship to promote their personal schemes. Little by little, the brightness of his nature and his intellectual sensitiveness were smothered under a poisonous crust steadily thickening and hardening with the flattery bestowed upon him, until his interest in general social advancement weakened, and he became more aware of the obstacles to reform. With the darkening of his social idealism, the traditions in which he had been reared renewed their rivalry. It was easy to fall back into ways of ease. The career of hardship which he had elected came to seem foolish to him, as the pressure from his return to ancient loyalties intensified. Because the lotus flower blooms in muddy water, he fancied that he could mingle in a moral quagmire and retain the purity of his character. Retracing his steps at this midpoint of his life, his sympathy with his wife's ideals faded, and he began to demand her return to the old shell of feudalistic subjection from which he had pulled her with his own hands. It was he who had encouraged me to launch on an independent career and be brave and daring. He rang the bell and woke me from my peaceful dream of parasitism. I would not have thought of attending the business school in New York to get a professional training if my wedded guide had not constantly preached to me the virtues of self-support. I would have had no urge to be a businesswoman Without his prodding, nor without his help, would I have had courage to participate in the birth control movement. Now the steersman of my boat was trying to reverse its chartered course, while the oarsman wanted to pull straight ahead. Naturally, a melancholy mood took possession of me. Being a Japanese wife in a period of economic and political transition, I faced two roads leading far apart, one to women's economic and personal independence, the other to renewed feudal subjection. The more I tried to unite them, the wider they seemed to branch. The damage which the earthquake had done was found to be even more decisive than we had calculated at first. Our shop commodities, family treasures, and other forms of wealth were destroyed, while our debts remained untouched. However, I did not and could not break down at this calamity. I started my business again, and expected that my husband would be pleased with my undefeated soul and strength. But this met with a totally unexpected attitude from him. Instead of giving me warm encouragement, he even began to meddle in the trifles of my business enterprise to its disadvantage. I had to realize that no individual life is to be segregated from community life, that no woman can expect special treatment as a favored person while her sisters move in an atmosphere of submission and dependence. Perhaps it was natural that my husband should change in his mood and begin to treat me as other men treated their wives. As I observed his mind alter, I had to consider the future seriously. Mental struggles, social work, and the strain of the earthquake badly affected my health. I could not solve my problems by myself, though I tried to put them in the form of clear questions. Have I selected independence merely to war against my beloved husband? Why does my personal growth separate me from my husband, instead of fulfilling my primary purpose, to cooperate with him for the advancement of his own work? I still felt great responsibility towards my husband, who obviously had likewise lost his peace of mind, although its immediate cause was the too complex nature of human society, which, with its hard and ugly facts and complicated troubles, had shattered much of his youthful optimism. So I closed my Minerva yarn shop, which had been a notable success, willing to make the sacrifice if I could win home life in the process by restoring our mutual happiness. I also felt the need for rest. In the circumstances, we agreed to make another trip for America, for which country we both felt a special affection. The charm of the United States had been enhanced in our minds by her kindness to Japan at the time of the earthquake. Men and materials had come to us from America as first aid in the relief work. The citizens of Tokyo and Yokohama cheered with gratitude when they saw the big khaki-colored motor trucks, distinguished by the mark USA, distribute flour for bread, cans for food, blankets, shoes, and clothes, even though some of the garments were twice or even 3 times too big for the small Japanese, and medical provisions. The American ambassador, Mr. Cyrus E. Woods, was the center of admiration for the sufferers in the ruined cities. The hearty sympathy of the American citizens across the ocean, beautifully named the Pacific, made a deep impression on the Japanese, and moved my husband and me to revisit America instead of choosing some new objective for our trip of recreation. Taking my younger sister, Kiyo Hirota, we left Tokyo when the signs of reconstruction could be detected by the smell of fresh timbers lying where the old had met destruction. Yokohama was still in a wrecked condition, and the piers were half sunk in the water. As we sailed away on the USS President Grant, May 13, 1924. The United States in 1924 was at the zenith of her capitalistic glory. Her industry seemed to be expanding to limitless proportions. The great empire of America was reaching to the highest stage in the history of mankind from the standpoint of material power. The financial axis of the world had shifted from London to New York, but it was not this phase of America which lured us there. New York had for me the charm of a second home. One may feel intense affection for a place where one has met conflict and yet won victories. Light footmarks on a smooth path may have a feebler appeal. So on reaching New York, I went over the old ground of my new world challenges, and in doing so took fresh stock of myself. This time, however, we lodged at the plaza instead of in a boarding house. This was a different perspective on New York, but I had not forgotten my sympathetic landlady, Miss Nelson. She had died since my first visit, to my deep regret. The school where I had taken a business course had not changed during the 5 years, and I was happy to renew friendships there. It was a joy to see again Miss Sanger, who had been my inspiration and guide as a promoter of birth control movement in the Far East. Dr. and Miss Charles A. Beard, who had been in Tokyo before the earthquake and who had returned on the first steamer to reach Yokohama after the disaster, were likewise my friends. Dr. Beard had been municipal advisor to the mayor of Tokyo. Baron Shimpei Gato, later Count Gato, and when the mayor became home minister charged with the reconstruction of Tokyo, he again sought advice from Dr. Beard. My whole time did not have to be given to schoolwork during this second New York visit. I had leisure for seeing old friends. I made many new ones. It was a great treat to be taken to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Howard Mansfield, whose collection of Japanese kakemono is of high value. Mr. Mansfield's understanding of Japanese art was, I thought, a more powerful factor in the promotion of goodwill between our two nations than all the diplomatic speeches of empty formality lumped together. When a people who have reached a high peak of aesthetic taste and a people who have attained heights of industrial efficiency can associate sympathetically, a basis seems laid for amity, with potentials for a fine superstructure of international culture. We Japanese are very proud of our art. It pleases us to our marrow to meet Westerners who are sensitive to the sources of our pride. No doubt, too, the West likes reciprocity in this respect. I was also entertained by Mr. and Mrs. Frank A. Vanderlip in their home at Scarborough-on-Hudson, which includes among its numerous rooms one suggestive of things Japanese. Guests to whom I was introduced there had a fellow feeling for our art. Miss Vanderlip was then undertaking the heavy task of raising the reconstruction fund for Tsuda College, a girls' school in Tokyo for the study of English especially, founded under Christian auspices. Its buildings had been destroyed in the earthquake, and the students were trying to go on with their work in barrack-like quarters set aside for the emergency. The present Tsuda College, some miles outside the city of Tokyo, in a beautiful spot among the pines, is a tribute to the energy of Miss Vanderlip and her American Finance Committee. All the Japanese regard this institution in such handsome surroundings as a splendid demonstration of international goodwill. Miss Vanderlip also presented the Federation of Women's Societies with a fine working library of feminist literature. I now had an opportunity to talk with many American feminists, notably Miss Carrie Chapman Catt, who kindly gave a luncheon for me, and Miss Harriet Stanton Bloch. In association with them, I came to understand better the amount of persistence and sacrifice that the women's movement demand. I had not realized before how hard the English women had battled for enfranchisement, or the American women's long battle either. I never tired of listening to the stories of how they contended for the vote, how they made speeches from soap boxes, how they paraded all in white. I wanted to know all this history, for I felt it would have to be repeated in Japan. Miss Catt sent me a copy of her book, Woman Suffrage and Politics, with these encouraging words written on the fly-leaf: to Baroness Ishimoto, who I predict will lead the women of Japan to their emancipation from outworn traditions. The sympathy of these American leaders strengthened my resolves. I thrilled at the idea of mutual respect and understanding, overriding the barriers of distance and race. On this trip we explored more of the American continent than on our previous sojourn in the United States. I traveled with my husband and sister to many American cities. I stayed with friends in New England and went south to New Orleans, along the beautiful Mississippi. Everywhere, the active, happy, and healthy American women fascinated me. They never seemed afraid of anything. What they wanted to do, they apparently tried to do and succeeded in doing. They worked seriously, but they enjoyed themselves heartily. What a contrast they presented to Japanese women, indifferent to personality or rights or the power of will, bound by the chains of tradition and conventions. Two extremes divided by the Pacific. One typified joy and freedom, the other wasteful martyrdom. Another great difference between West and East, which gripped my mind, was the divergence in the living conditions of the two worlds. American civilization was revelatory of material and mechanical progress. In home surroundings, Japanese sank down, by this comparison, into the shades of domestic poverty. I got the impression that, come what might in the way of political repression, American women would never be reduced to servitude. Even my short stay in the United States restored my health and cleared away the gloom that had settled upon my spirit. The youthful democratic country worked like magic on the subject of an ancient state. I felt fresh energy springing up within me. I was ready once more for the battle at home. Chapter 22. Europe in Transition. Japanese who go to Europe before seeing America, almost without exception, become pro-European. Those who visit America first become pro-American in their sentiments. Men who think of my Great Britain like to don bowler hats and wear white spats. Those who put the Yankees first emphasize neckties and indulge in American slang. In some such fashion, Westerners divide into pro-Chinese and pro-Japanese. My husband and I tried to imagine ourselves seeing America and Europe at the same time, in order to be objective and impartial. At least we went on again to England and Europe from America. I was anxious to see my niece, who had been born in London, a darling little creature, so dark of skin, with thick black hair and big dark eyes, that she looked like a little bear on the lap of her fair-skinned and fair-haired English nurse. England was now on the eve of labor ascendancy. Burgess's liberalism seemed to have regained its sway on the continent. Social unrest in Italy was being subdued under fascist power. Anti-Soviet propaganda in France was sweeping the communists aside. While all dissension was by no means allayed, outward signs indicated a social truce, if involuntary. We were invited to lunch by Professor Keynes of King's College, and asked him many questions pertaining to the economic situation of the world. We also visited Mr. Harold Cox, the former editor of the Edinburgh Review, who explained to us the leading national traits of the British people, and emphasized their superiority in the matter of self-government, pointing out many historical facts and customs by way of illustration. I talked with Dr. Drysdale, president of the Malthusian League, and Miss Drysdale, about whom I had heard so much through Margaret Sanger. I was particularly anxious to know what Dr. Drysdale thought about the Neo-Malthusian theory in relation to women's economic and political emancipation. He was very hospitable and kind. He was patient when I questioned him, but he appeared to be concerned only with the protection of motherhood. In view of English conservatism, he had displayed a heroic attitude in this cause at the birth control clinic in Woolworth Center, and public opinion now seemed more favorable than in America, where a Puritan repression was hampering the movement. I also visited Dr. Stope's clinic, but she was out of town, and I missed the pleasure of meeting her. However, I was shown all that my eyes could take in. London taught me invaluable lessons. Berlin was a hitherto unknown capital for me. Its people looked so exhausted that I was shocked. Political order had been restored by the Republicans, and industries were recovering, but unemployment was rife, and the streets were crowded with persons obviously in dire need. A feeling of despair was settling like a pall over Germany, induced in part by the Dawes Plan, which goaded the Germans to labor and yet refused to buy their goods. There was no glow in the German eyes, and no buoyancy in the German manner. Anxiety about personal and national existence was uppermost in their minds and hearts. The lean men in patched suits and the women in torn shoes talked endlessly about the heavy burden laid on them by the Versailles Treaty. The war was started without the people being consulted, but the result affected every individual. Whether the load could be carried another year, everyone doubted. German protest against the treaty was countered by the Allies' threats, as everyone knows, so German complaints found no remedy. The atmosphere of Berlin was charged with melancholy. During my short stay there, I visited some of the girls' schools and public institutions. It was hard to find any girl or teacher wearing decent shoes. There was no style in their dress, and any garment was better than none, of course. I looked into the pots which contained their luncheon, and learned that hot potato soup was the main nourishment for youthful hungry stomachs. The rationalization of industry encouraged dumping and national starvation, coupled with the policy of inflation, which caused increasingly high prices within the country, were Germany's attempts to survive while conforming to the Versailles Treaty. But resentment against the treaty poured from the lips of every German with whom I came in contact. At Cologne, naturally, the French army occupying the Rut district was the focus of attention. To foreigners who admire French art and German science, the French and the Germans are alike so admirable, each in their way, that the idea of there being such fierce enemies is almost incomprehensible. I pictured to myself the people of the working classes shaking hands across the borders of these countries as a common protest against their mutual enemies, whose territorial and imperialistic ambitions do so much to prolong this belligerency. I left Germany with the feeling that I had seen a truly defeated nation, its population as a whole, fatally punished without personal sin. This suffering seemed to me a warning to my own country, whose people had never been defeated in a foreign war through 2,000 years of insularity, but instead have been flattered by success in extending territory and markets for industrial output as a result of modernization. From Germany, we went to Switzerland. In Geneva, we had the delight of being with Dr. Ch19-22, then vice chairman at the administration office of the League of Nations. It was like being with my own father to chat with Dr. Ch19-22, and at this center of international politics and diplomacy, he reassured me with regard to my private ideals. He took us on a drive around the beautiful lake and the historic spots in the country. He described the League's work and introduced us to many prominent people of different nationalities. I was proud to have Dr. Ch19-22 in Geneva, not only as an officer of the League, but as a representative of the internationally minded and cultured Japanese. Marseille was our next station, and there we boarded a French boat for Naples. As all the tourists in Naples do, we strolled through the excavated city of Pompeii. But in Italy as a whole, with its long history, its excitable race, its artistic tradition, and its physical conditions, mountainous land, and poor natural resources, we experienced the sensation of being Japanese at home. Italy is so like Japan. Even the religious climate suggests analogies. The herd-like obedience of the masses to blind instinct, the official policy of non-interference with the course of nature, which the Church deems best for a suffering population, and the inevitable outcome. Walking through the slums of Naples, it had been my intention to escape these. On the way to famous spots, I saw the actual results of large family adoration. Crowds of ill-fed, ill-clad children, some of whom were crippled, others blind, and all pale and malformed, crying on the dirty streets and in the dark warrens, made me sick at heart. These slums seemed even worse than the slums of Japanese cities, since Italians obviously did not object to sharing their shelter with donkeys and cows, a thing never found among the Japanese, with their devotion to personal cleanliness. It was clearer to me than ever that birth control must be understood by religious people, that human children should not be born to live the life of pigs and swarms of flies. A beggar's existence is not worth having. Noble thinking does not correspond with the quest for a copper to buy an immediate morsel of bread with only despair for tomorrow, leaving behind the city of Naples with its blue sky, colorful roofs and walls, its green foliage. Our boat went on to Palermo, the Sicilian town of ancient charm, offering fascination comparable to that of turning back the leaves of an historical picture book. So our foreign trip ended. I had spent 6 months abroad this time, now as a provincial woman on a sightseeing tour, now as a student of birth control and women's problems, again as an observer of political and economic development in different nations. Within a given space of time, I had seen many races and nations. I had come to the conclusion that the American woman hold the most enviable position of all women. I saw how others lived and operated. I compared other peoples, other conditions of life and labor, and other ideals and programs with the Japanese people, their social setting, and their intelligence, and I reached a firmer ground for my personal determinations.